united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 3 of Politico's Competitive Europe Week Summit. My name's Aoife White, and I'm Politico's Technology and Competition Editor. Congratulations to those of you who sat here or watched online for the past 2 days, where we tried to shed light on what could make Europe more competitive. And thank you to those of you who've joined us for our third and last day. We'll focus now on technology, and specifically on artificial intelligence, which promises us a brave new world. But what does that look like? What can we expect? And what potential pitfalls are there? We've just come out of a very intense period of lawmaking, and we still haven't seen what all that new regulation means. Our first panel will try to ask and answer where we are and what's going to come next. We'll then speak to one of Microsoft's main men in Europe, Nick Banasevic. Along with competitiveness, one of the great buzzwords of the European debate in the past few years has been European champions, and we'll be diving a little later into what it means to have EU tech champions. Later this morning, we'll look at security in cyberspace, and then we'll be turning our attention a little higher to the final frontier and looking at actual space policy. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank our partners for making this summit possible. Our leading partners are Asea, Booking.com, FPA and Google. Our presenting partners, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, Santander and Vodafone. Our knowledge partners, McKinsey Global Institute, and our visibility partners, German Council on Foreign Relations and the German Marshall Fund. We do have a few housekeeping rules. We love a good debate, so let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts with us on X or any social media you prefer using our hashtag, which is hashtag Politico Competitive Week. We do appreciate hearing your thoughts on what you've heard. There will be a coffee break and a lunch break, so come and meet our pro team. I hear there are some macarons. I've seen them actually out there. They look very nice. And you can check out some of our partners' installations and get chatting to many of the fine people in this room. And now let's get going. We will hear from Peter Lochbihler, Global Head of Public Affairs from Booking.com, followed by a panel discussion. Has EU tech regulation reached its peak? Moderated by our Senior Technology Reporter, Clotilde Goujard. Thank you. And thanks for... one moment, sorry, Peter, can I bring you to the stage?
Good morning and welcome on behalf of Booking.com. Become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. I'm sure some of you in the room have been around for a while, recognize the Lisbon strategy. This is what 24 years ago the EU leaders set out to declare as the objective. Now, bold projects take time to deliver tangible results, one might argue. Sadly, in this case, the opposite happened. Europe has fallen behind on competitiveness and productivity, driven by a lack of innovation and adoption of technology. And the recent reports by Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi are crystal clear in their assessment of the situation and in their recommendations. Now, I'm not standing here today as the know-it-all who is pointing back to shortcomings of the past. There are reasons, good or bad, while we are not where we wanted to get in 2000. But we can't change the past. The only relevant question from here onwards will be, is anything going to be different this time around than 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago? I do sense momentum in Brussels and in the member states' capitals. And the reason for it is that the world in 2024 is fundamentally different from just 5 years ago. We've had a devastating pandemic. We have a war on the borders outside of the EU. We have rise in geopolitical instability, and going along with that, a decline of multilateralism. Also, there was no ChatGPT in 2019, so technological advancement continues to develop at lightning speed. Now, in order to refinance hundreds of billions of COVID debt, in order to finance better defense capabilities, in order to improve Europe's sovereignty, we need a thriving and competitive economy that generates jobs and tax revenue. At high level, there seems to be broad alignment on this objective. But the question I have is whether that wind of change that I feel will reach the corridors of the Commission's DGs, will reach the European Parliament's committees, will reach the national ministries. How will that momentum translate into action this time round? How will it show up in ongoing and upcoming legislative initiatives? That, to me, is a question of political leadership that needs to come from Brussels. Now, tying all of this to this morning's panels, I will not aim to answer the questions. I'll leave that to the distinguished panel in a moment. I'd just like to share 3 pieces of food for thought on the regulatory part of Draghi's and Letta's assessment. And number one, to policymakers, a plea that I would have is to take a step back, to pause and to be very intentional and ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve and what are the right measures to get there? Because one thing seems clear to me, if the Brussels effect that we all are also proud of to some extent, but if the Brussels effect were a guarantee for economic success in Europe, then we should be in a better place by now. I believe regulation in and by itself is not a guarantee to make Europe a relevant factor in the world. Because if that regulatory ambition is not backed up by the underlying technology and leadership innovation that translates into economic power, it will not lead us to the results that we want to see. Because economic decline is impacting our standard of living, it's impacting our strategic autonomy, and it's impacting Europe's weight in the global economy. And I believe in the geopolitical reality of 2024, we will not be a regulatory superpower without being an economic superpower. Number 2, think global in everything you do. I don't believe we need European champions as in champions within the EU. What we need more of is global champions that are born in Europe, that scale from Europe to become global market leaders. In his report, Mario Draghi pointed out that there's not a single European company that was founded in the past 50 years that has generated a global market capitalization of more than 100 billion euros. I would argue there's one exception, actually, and will be represented on the next panel here. Booking.com was founded in Amsterdam in 1996, has grown from there, scaled from there. Alongside Booking, there are 2 other European tech champions. There's SAP, there's ASML, both of them also above the 100 billion market cap mark. But the reality is, of course, that in the US, we have 6 companies who pass the 1 trillion market cap. So we still pale in comparison to that. And we need a framework that makes it easier for today's startups and scale-ups in Europe to become tomorrow's global tech leaders. And third point, and to finish, while it's important to get more European tech leaders, let's also be very careful not to leave behind the SMEs, who account for 60% of all jobs in Europe. And most of Europe's productivity gap can actually be explained by the poor adoption of digital technologies. Small businesses are typically less productive than large enterprises, but if we want to preserve the rich diversity of small business, often family-owned across Europe, and at the same time become more competitive, then we need to find better ways of helping those small businesses across Europe to adopt technology. There's huge potential in the diffusion, and again, Draghi has some very pertinent points on this one. But since SMEs won't be able to do it by themselves, we also need to find better ways to have big and small collaborate and overcome a bit of a mindset that I sometimes feel that is small against big and old against new. For me, it's through collaboration that we create the value that we need to see. And as Booking.com will share some ideas on this one with the new incoming commissioners and the new MEPs, exactly on the point how big and small, how new and old can collaborate for the interest of Europe as an economic superpower, and then it can also be a regulatory superpower. With that, I leave it to the panel and wish us all a great day of good discussions, and looking forward to see you later. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome if you're tuning in now or joining us in the room at Politico's Competitive Europe Week. My name is Clotilde Goujat. I'm a senior technology reporter at Politico, and I'll be moderating this panel on EU tech regulation and whether it has reached its peak. The EU has become known in the last years for its Brussels effect, effectively setting strong rules, generally in the digital sphere, with global impact. In the last mandate, Brussels adopted many major laws to regulate topics and technologies from content moderation to artificial intelligence. Regulators are now ramping up their enforcement of Europe's privacy rules, the GDPR, while new watchdogs, including Jeremy Godfrey, who we hear from later on, but also the Commission, Lucila, Werner, I mean, not so much Werner, but Lucila, are going full speed. Well, you're not enforcing the rules yourself, I'd say, are going full speed with the application of the Digital Services and Markets Act. And let's not forget, well, the Artificial Intelligence Act. So are we getting to a time where Brussels needs to ease up on the regulatory machine? How can we better apply existing laws? To answer these questions, we have several great panelists. Anna Cavazzini, member of the European Parliament, representing the Greens from Germany, and also the chair of the Internal Market Committee in the European Parliament, again, obviously. Jeremy Godfrey, who's the executive chairperson at Ireland's Media and Platform Regulator. I won't say the actual name in Irish because I have no idea how to pronounce it properly, but this is what we'll have for now. We have from Bookings, Maria Rocha Barras, Senior Vice President, Chief Legal and Public Affairs Officer, and Lucila Cioli, Director for the Artificial Intelligence Office at the European Commission's DG Connect. And last but not least, Werner Stang, Senior Expert on Digital Policy in the Cabinet of European Commission Executive Vice President, Margrethe Vestager. Before we start, a brief reminder to talk about us on social media platforms, the ones you like best, with the hashtag Politico Competitive Week. All right, Werner, I'll start with you. You joined the Commission in 1996, if I'm correct. You've worked for many years in DG Connect, and you're about to finish a full mandate as the Cabinet Advisor on Digital. So you've had a good look at all of these laws, all of these drafting, these negotiations, from the DSA to the DMA to the AI Act. How do you see the EU's digital policy evolving in the next mandate?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. And indeed, these were quite eventful years, and Peter already described this very well. By the way, I agree with everything you said on the need to take the next step towards making Europe even more competitive. I would say, since you all stressed legislation so much, that this mandate was not just about legislating, because it was also the mandate where a real digital policy, a real digital strategy was put on the table by Commission President von der Leyen, making Europe fit for the digital age. And Peter mentioned, of course, the crises and the responses to those crises. And part of that was an unprecedented commitment to investing in digital technologies. And not just a commitment, but this was also translated into the digital decade, which is already part of an answer to your question. Looking forward, digital decade 2030 means that this new commission obviously will keep that as a main priority, investing in the digital technologies and digital skills throughout the board. A lot of money also, thanks to the pandemic, also went into digital technologies and so on and so forth. So it's not just a legislative agenda, but it needs to be taken to the next level. One thing that's important also looking backwards and forwards is that we all talk about legislation, compliance costs, administrative burden, and now we have to stop this. I think, first of all, it's clear that we are not going to legislate a lot on digital. That becomes clear from the political guidelines, from the mission letters. It's in line with the Draghi and Letta reports. It's about consolidating, implementing, enforcing, making use of that legal framework while keeping to invest in digital technologies. But also here, I really want to stress that not all legislation just means compliance costs and holds back Europe. A lot of the narrative of our digital rule book was to provide the guardrails, obviously, for the development of digital technologies in Europe. It is there to create trust. Who would admit general purpose AI into their living rooms or companies if there is no trust in the technology? Who would ever hop on an automated vehicle if there is no trust that it doesn't kill you or others on the road? What company would be able and willing to share data into data spaces with competitors if there is no trust that this data management will happen in a trustworthy way? It's also about legal certainty. If you do comply with the AI Act, then obviously, as a startup, as a scale-up, you have a single market in front of you, which was underlying all of our laws. It's also about level playing field that pieces like the Digital Services Act are generating vis-à-vis platforms. It's about the Digital Market Act, which provides, of course, compliance costs for the gatekeepers, but offers opportunities for all other companies out there. So just to dispel the myth that it is just legislation, Brussels is so stupid, while the Americans and the Chinese are investing, we just come up with new laws. Now, of course, if you look into the political guidelines, what von der Leyen stresses is the need for competitiveness in agreement with everybody, as Peter rightly said. And it's a lot about tech diffusion. That's the new concept for the next stage, that we now, based on the guardrails and opportunities that we have also created with those laws, we make sure that all companies, including the small and medium-sized companies, actually adopt digital technologies to become more productive and more innovative. And a lot of the new initiatives will go exactly in that direction.
Thanks. Lucila, in the last few months, as we've heard here and we keep hearing, we've seen a lot of criticism about how EU has been regulating the use of data and the impact on the development of new technologies like AI. First, I want to zoom in on what the former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi said over the summer. He warned that Europe's tech sector was lagging for several reasons, and one of them, he said, was related to European laws. He said, I quote, while the ambitions of the EU's GDPR and AI Act are commendable, their complexity and risk of overlaps and inconsistencies can undermine developments in the field of AI by EU industry actors. What can you do, and what will you do to ensure the AI Act is not enforced in a way that overlaps or create inconsistencies with the GDPR?
Good morning, first of all. Thanks for the question. And first of all, the overlap between the AI Act and the GDPR is, I don't see it. It's not there. We have paid a lot of attention to develop a piece of legislation on AI, which is actually complementary with other pieces of legislation. So, the AI Act is addressing in particular high-risk artificial intelligence systems, which violates fundamental rights, and obviously violation of privacy is a fundamental right. But the regulation itself is addressed to the deployers of these systems, and they have to undertake a certain certification process before they put the system on the European market. On the contrary, the GDPR is addressing those organizations that process personal data. So AI, of course, uses data, but if you look at the AI Act takes GDPR as a given. When we sometimes speak with our American colleagues, for example, we hardly talk about privacy, because for us, the privacy is a given. It's respected in the European Union because of GDPR. The AI Act does not introduce anything new about the use of personal data. On the other hand, when you speak with other jurisdictions, for example, the United States, where there is no such a privacy regulation, when they talk about AI Act, they talk a lot about privacy as well. So what do we do now to make sure that the AI Act is not too complicated to implement? I agree that at first sight it may look complicated, but to be frank, it's a set of rules that we showed from the very beginning. We believe that any serious data scientist who is developing an AI system that is high risk because it may violate fundamental rights is going to make sure that the data set is of quality, is going to document the system, is going to make sure it's robust to cyber attacks and it's accurate. So I think that we are introducing a number of obligations in terms of what, in my opinion, any real serious data scientist would do. So I think it is important to comply with it. We didn't really make a distinction between the small, medium enterprises and the larger companies. The small, medium enterprises have a simplified kind of approach to risk management, but the rest of the rules are the same, because the risks are the same, whether you're a small company or you're a bigger company. And we are really very much engaging with stakeholders. You may have heard of the AI Pact, for example. This is an initiative that was put in place to anticipate the implementation of the requirements, but it's an initiative we are using to identify with enterprises best practices for the implementation of the AI Act. And we will engage a lot with small, medium enterprises and startups across the European Union to bring these best practices. We also work very heavily on standardization, because if we can develop European harmonized standards, companies will be able to say, well, I comply with that standard. I don't have to do anything more in terms of my certification process than just saying, I comply with that standard. And last but not least, we are really working with member states now to provide guidance exactly on the delineation with other pieces of legislation, GDPR, but also machinery regulation or medical device regulation. And this is a work we do with member states and with experts in those fields, making sure that companies need to only undertake one CE marking process and not two. And so we are going to work to simplify all the possible processes in the European Union. And we have some time, for this we have a couple of years' time.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Maria, you ensure your company Booking.com is complying with these laws. So what is your view on the Draghi report and also on what Lucila just said? Is there no overlap between, in your view, and how you're preparing to comply with the AI Act, the GDPR? How do you see the regulatory framework at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So just very quickly, what I'm speaking comes, I will give you just a little bit of color from where I'm coming from. As Peter said, we are a Dutch company. We started in the Netherlands, and we still are. We have 7,000 employees in Amsterdam, and we are very proud to be part of that ecosystem. What I would say is that also we are very international, because to comply with all these laws, the second point where I'm coming from is that we are present everywhere. So we have to do the patchwork of complying with laws around the world, and it's never going to be perfect. I have zero expectation that there's not going to be any overlap. One of the things I say very frequently is the blanket is too short sometimes, you know, that you pull for one side, then there's something else you have to deal with. So we actually have lawyers qualified in more than 10 different countries, and I'm just saying that to show the complexity of how it is to manage this. And I'm here today as Booking.com, but I'm also the president of Association of In-House Lawyers called ACC in Europe that represent the legal departments of companies. And I get a lot of the feedback there. And we do an anonymous survey with CLOs, and their biggest concern is interpretation and not understanding the laws correctly. And that's what's supposed, you asked me, like, Maria, you are in charge of the legal department, and it's not just up to me on how things are interpreted. So I would say that we have to, every legal system, and I'm going to go a little philosophical here, comes from an assumption that people know the law, right? It's a presumption that you always need to have in any legal system. But the problem is that we don't always know the law, and the businesses don't always know the law. So that's why collaboration is so important. And I think right now we are in a moment that we need to, in my view, let the dust settle and understand how these laws are impacting us, and really confirm whether, I think it's too early to say whether there is overlap or no overlap, impact or not impact. I think I completely believe on the intent not to have overlap, but I think devil will be on the details as we go through. And when we speak about impact, I think we also need to really use the power of universities, think tanks, and they know how to measure impact more than many of us, in my view. So really have robust ways to see if the impact that was intended with the law is actually being fulfilled. And that for me is, I don't think anybody will feel sorry for big tech companies to have to spend a lot of time with compliance. I would just say that yesterday I spent the day with the European Tech Alliance, and I had a great day with the European tech companies, the smaller ones, smaller, medium-sized ones, and they were saying that they spent 30% of engineering time doing compliance work. So they are concerned. What we need to learn, of course, is if over time if this is going to go down. And the last comment I would make is that when we think about impact, I've been thinking a lot about this also in the decisions that we make every day at Booking. Think about impacts to employees, to partners, to small and medium-sized companies, to big companies. It's not just one impact. And I think going through that exercise is going to be important to also make sure that we are fulfilling the purpose in the right balanced way, because Booking has to balance this. We have to balance the interest of travelers and hotels, our partners. And I think this is going to be a very important exercise as we continue to see how the laws are evolving. And I would say the Draghi report in some ways confirms this, right? And I think the predictability of the legal system will be very important for companies. So those are some of my reflections.
Right, thanks. And I'm turning to you now. Adding to what Maria said, we've also heard even more from other companies. Recently, there was an open letter coordinated by one of these big tech firm, Meta, but it was also signed on by European companies like Spotify, SAP, or Ericsson, that again said Europe risks falling further behind in the AI era due to inconsistent regulatory decision-making and fragmented regulation. When you hear these complaints from tech companies, how do you respond? How much of that do you read as like, oh, again, tech companies complaining about regulation? And how much do you actually, hear as real concerns that you as a politician want to address in your upcoming mandate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the invitation and for the great panel and for the great summit. I think we have to look again, what do we want to reach with the regulation? And I want to stress that no one in the European Union, no one in the Parliament, I guess also no one in the Commission wants to regulate for the sake of regulation because we like it so much sitting in 30-hour trialogues and talk to each other. No, of course it is because we want to have the society move in the right direction. And again, from this campaign in my constituency, I can just say that the extreme right also was winning so much because they dominate everything over social media and they are favored by the algorithms. And I'm so happy that we decided in the European Union to have the DSA. I'm meeting so many small companies who want to get active in the tech sector, and they tell me the fact that we have the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and for the first time make it really easier for us to access the market is a big win for society. So I just want to mention again that we try to regulate for the common good. And of course, there's always, as my colleague said, compliance costs. Because, of course, the companies have to adapt. They have to understand what is in the regulation. I think as lawmakers, we have to make sure that we make it easy for companies. We don't have overlaps. We make it everything digital. We don't have 50 different reporting requirements. But, of course, regulation aims at behavioral change. And that's why, of course, the companies also will have to adapt at some point. But I think, having this bigger goal in mind and the question what do we really want to reach is very important, and we should not forget in this whole competitiveness debate. And I don't know, all the research that I know, but probably people can also correct me, it is not that America or the US, because also the Draghi report always compares us to Europe to the US, that all the tech companies were so successful because we had completely over-regulation at the EU. I think we didn't have any tech regulation at that time in the EU. There were different reasons why companies in the US were probably more successful in the sector. So it cannot be explained with over-regulation that we're falling behind, really. So we have to really look at the different factors. I'm completely aligned with making, of course, slim regulation, effective regulation, no overlaps. But we have to regulate, and I think we have to be also really careful that we don't have a big backlash in this term. Companies aligning with also a very right-wing parliament where also the extreme right is attacking the tech regulation because it's not in their favor. And this I find a very dangerous situation.
Jeremy, I'm now turning to you as a regulator implementing some of these laws. We've seen, for example, with the GDPR, that we had quite different interpretations around the EU. Obviously, the DSA was designed with this in mind to try to put some power in the hands of the European Commission to have a European level view and regulation. But you're also working similarly regulating some of these same platforms that the European Commission is regulating under the DSA. And we're already seeing, for example, some guidelines, some code of conduct. And I'm thinking, for example, you have a sort of code, an online safety code, because you're also enforcing the Audiovisual Services, Media Services Directive. How do you make sure that some of what you're doing at your level is not overlapping with the European Commission or other regulators across the EU?
Okay, thanks very much. Before I just want to comment on something Maria said, which she talked about 30% of effort being spent on compliance, and a few panelists have talked about compliance costs. I would say these are safety costs. This is not money being spent. The compliance is not an end in itself. The compliance is there to make services safer, to protect the fundamental rights of people. So it may be labelled as compliance costs because left to themselves in the market, they wouldn't invest. The services wouldn't be designed to be safe, wouldn't be designed to uphold fundamental rights. I asked you earlier whether it was permitted to use the word enshittification, and I'm not going to point any fingers at anybody. I'm just going to comment that the fact that this word has been coined is an indicator that innovation in the market that we have at the moment, in the data-driven economy, is not always targeted at better services that consumers want. Coming to your question about the online safety code in the AVMSD, I think one miracle happened in Ireland, which was that Commission Iman how we say it in Irish, was asked to be both the digital services coordinator and the enforcer of the AVMSD, despite the fact that those are two different ministries who have policy responsibility. And that's, if that hadn't happened, it would have been really difficult to make the two things consistent. But we looked at under the AVMSD, the particular article is focused on video sharing platforms. The approach we took in the Online Safety Code was, I think as someone was saying, the AI Act assumes the GDPR. For our Online Safety Code, we assumed the DSA, and we said, well, what additional things are appropriate to address the harms of the video sharing platforms? And we found it quite useful to be able to classify certain types of content, so content that promotes self-harm and suicide, content that promotes eating and feeding disorders, cyberbullying, and saying that really this kind of content should be subject to, in that case we said we think the video sharing platforms should not permit that kind of content at all. And we also looked at content like pornography or extreme and gratuitous violence, and we thought that that was a type of content which needed to be protected by effective age assurance so that children aren't normally able to see it. And so in contrast to the DSA, we've put in place much more specific rules. So under the DSA, you have the Article 28 on minor protection, but that would there need to be guidelines, there would need to be a proof of harm, whereas I think in some cases you can cut to the chase and say there's some things that obviously platforms should do, and let's set some specific rules. But we did put a lot of effort into making sure it aligned with the DSA. It went through the TRIS process, so the Commission had a look at it to see how it thought it was consistent. It's not perfect in that this is our online safety code. Our rules about pornography apply to platforms based in Ireland. So X is probably one of the platforms based in Ireland that permits pornography. LinkedIn, for example, doesn't, so it won't have to comply. But if you look at some of the other more widespread platforms that focus on adult content, they're based in Cyprus, they're based in Slovenia, they're based in Slovakia. They don't have the same rules. So there certainly could be a case, I would think, for greater harmonization and consistency of the rules on video sharing platforms. But I know that this is something I think in the next year the Commission is looking at the interaction of DSA and other things. But last thing I just want to come back to, has it reached the peak? I think we feel ourselves climbing up a mountain towards a peak. I don't think we've reached the peak. There may be some other peaks in the distance that we haven't yet seen. But from our point of view, we think, we look at the online environment. We see that, the interests of children are not protected. I think Peter talked about the geopolitical, and you talked about the rise of the far right. Of course, the online environment needs to allow a wide expression of political opinions, including ones that we might regard as unpalatable, but it has to do so in a lawful way. Certainly, we need to protect against coordinated and authentic behaviour and disinformation. So the protection of democracy is a key thing for us. On the consumer side, we don't think consumer rights, there's still fraud, there are scams online. We've seen threats to public order, public safety, terrorism. So there's lots of things where I think as we climb up the mountain, we need to do better. And as between us and the Commission, we have we both have a role in regulating the platforms. We have some shared competencies. We each have some exclusive competencies. We've only been going less than a year, so almost everything we've been doing for the first time. And I think over the next little while, we'll be doing things for the second time and the third time, and we'll be able to work at maybe more, the cooperation can become more systematized, if you like. But I think at the moment, the signs are all very good.
Right. Lucilla, back to you and the AI Pact, because there was also a big meeting on AI from the Commission this week. Some of these companies, including Meta, but also Apple, passed up on joining the AI Pact voluntary initiative to start already applying the AI Act, which sets guardrails for the development of the technology, like you mentioned. Do you see this as a failure to to have failed to convince some of these major companies that have an impact that we all use in our daily life?
I don't consider it a failure because maybe these two companies didn't participate, but other big companies like Google and others did participate. So, we had more than 100, we had exactly 124 signatories to the AI Pact in the month of September, which is a very high number. And so we're very proud of it. And Meta didn't participate in this case, but for example, they are participating to the code of practice for the general purpose models, which is another stakeholders exercise that we are undertaking to identify with the providers of general purpose models, meaning like generative AI kind of models, how to comply with the obligations for those models that are in the AI Act. So we do have a lot of participation to the AI Pact. We are very pleased to see that because, as I said earlier, for us it's going to be very important to have a feedback loop with the companies to see what works well and what doesn't work well in implementation, in the practical implementation of the Act by companies, try to design best practices and push them to small, medium enterprises and to other companies in the European territory. So we are really making an important effort, and we're going to make a very important effort in the next 2 years in trying to make all the companies aware of the AI Act, aware of what they have to do. Of course, we will also be using automated tools. Nowadays, there are automated tools emerging and helping companies to understand better how to comply with the AI Act. So we will also make these instruments available for European companies. I just wanted to also make maybe reminding something that came to my mind when we were talking about fragmentation now, of the fact that, there have been so many discussions in AI in these past years, that if we didn't have one AI Act in the European Union, we would probably have 27 by now. So we often forget about the importance of having one act in the single market that all companies can comply with, and therefore they can facilitate also their life in being present in different European countries. I think this is an important point that we should not forget.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Werner, again, to go back to this idea that some companies like Meta are deciding not to release some of their new innovations or new tools because they're saying Europe is too inconsistent with its regulatory framework. How do you see this? Do you see this as Europe missing out on some innovations, or do you see this as yet another form of blackmail?
It's a very loaded question. And I don't think that the motivation is a lack of, or the reason is a lack of consistency or whatever it is. It is just that we have established guardrails of things that we want or do not want to be rolled out in Europe. And if a company decides that or thinks that they cannot provide services within those guardrails, well, that's their decision. I don't think that necessarily Europe will be falling behind just because a big provider does not offer a particular service in Europe. Right? We still have a lot of choice out there. But I would very much agree with what Jeremy said. When we talk about compliance costs, I very much like that point because it sounds like a very dirty word. It's like sort of money thrown out of the window, whereas it is money that is meant to ensure that services offered and developed in Europe meet certain standards that we considered important here in Europe. And when they say we, that's another important point. That means those laws were adopted by our democratic systems, by the lawmakers. And that's one of the major shifts that I've seen in the last few years. When we started to regulate all those large platforms, whether it's under the DSA, under the DMA, this was also to regain democratic control and oversight over services that have an effect on each and every one of us as citizens and every company out there. So we had come from a situation where those very successful platforms on which everybody else started to depend one way or the other, that they have set the rules of the game for all of us based on their own preferences, and the most prevalent motive, obviously, is to make money. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, if I'm working for a company, I want to maximize profits. But this profit maximization was not necessarily in line with the public interest. And we have started to realign a lot of that and said, okay, there are some democratically legitimized rules in place that say how these services can be rolled out in Europe. They are not perfect, can never be perfect. I mean, the number of trade-offs and balances to be struck in this mandate was mind-boggling. And of course, you cannot get it right. You know, one side would say this is not enough. The other would say, are you crazy? That's going too far. But I would still prefer that those choices are made in a democratic way. And then if we're not happy with them in a few years, well, then we can come back and say we may have to correct this, that, or the other.
Maria, what's your response to what you're hearing from mostly either regulators or lawmakers?
No, I want to clarify. I completely agreed with the point. You know, it's spending money on safety. I completely agree, and I don't think that compliance should be seen as a dirty word. I hope it's not, but sometimes, you know, we internally also rebrand it. We speak about trust of customers, safety, integrity, because we think that that's also very impactful. In the end, I don't think we disagree with the purpose. I think sometimes where we disagree with is how we get there. And also, I would say, when I was mentioning the 30% number, this is of engineering work. So sometimes people think, oh, in compliance is just a bunch of lawyers doing the work. It's actually not. It's a lot of engineers, and right, this is compliance by design, as it should be. And what we hear is that then they are not sometimes working on growing the company and innovation. But again, we can I don't know what's the right percentage, because actually I don't think it exists, the right percentage. The only challenge I would say is, I think it should be proportionate to the risk of the business. So I think a risk of certain risks for a social media platform is very different from a marketplace platform. And our call to action is that the business models, that we have regulations that are not one size fits all, but that are catered to the different business models. And business models is a big word, so sometimes I don't know if people, you know, how people are defining it. But what I mean is that you can have subscription models, you can have advertising models, you can have B2B, B2C, and all of this can have different impacts that need to be calibrated. So my ask for regulators is just to don't assume bad intent and be open-minded, and that we also learn together. Because I think I agree, I like when you said the metaphor of climbing the mountain. I am a couch mountaineer. That means that I love reading books about mountain expeditions. I don't do anything, but I love it. And what I like about it is because it's all about planning, managing risk proportionally. And I don't know if everybody knows this, but most people die in the way down, not on the way up, because they spend all their energy on the way down, on the way up, and then it's that we have a problem then. So let's think about this together as well, so that we save some of the energy on where it's needed. And that's another point I wanted to make. I don't think working on compliance for safety, for trust, is great. I think the challenge I see sometimes is that there are certain things that we have to do that doesn't seem to serve a purpose. And that happens when there is
what? Sorry, do you have specific examples?
Then it gets a little bit on probably dangerous territory. I will give you an example. Right now, it's still too early, but there are going to be regulations about protecting minors, and I completely agree with that. The risk of Booking.com in that space is very different from a risk of a social media platform. We are not catered for minors. We ask for credit cards for transactions. We have a number of controls, and I don't think it's not targeted for minors to book your holidays. It's usually their parents, right? So I just think that these things need to be taken into account when building reporting regulations, etc. And I would also say that if you ask me, what does Europe does well? I would say the dialogue is very good. Our experience with the DMA and the DSA and talking to the Commission on how to implement has been excellent. I think where I see some challenges is that the guidelines sometimes come later. So you don't have a lot of time. You have to be already in compliance, and guidelines either are issued very close to the compliance date or are not even issued, you know, and that creates the uncertainty. So I would like us to work more together so that we can have more clarity before, so that we can be compliant. We want to be compliant.
Yeah, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. Those very interesting observations. I might just say a little bit about minor compliance, because I think we're kind of more or less on the same page here.
Okay.
One thing I would observe is there's always, when you talk to people being regulated, there's always a bit of a tension between principles-based regulation and detailed regulation. And on the one hand, people say, oh, we want principles-based regulation, let us work out how to comply. On the other hand, they say, it's too vague, we need to know exactly what we have to do, otherwise there's too much uncertainty. And then you come into kind of principles plus guidelines. So if I look at the DSA, it's quite good. There are some things that are very specific. You must have a mechanism for reporting illegal content. You must have an internal complaints procedure. You must engage with trusted flaggers. Those are very specific. Then on minor protection, it's much more high level. You must protect the privacy, safety, and something else about minors. Yeah. And if I come just to look at our online safety code that you talked about, which I hope we very much will advocate for some of the ways we've approached that online safety code to be reflected in the Article 28 guidelines. So on that online safety code, we have an obligation to have parental controls. Mm-hmm. But that obligation does not apply to platforms where the terms and conditions have a minimum age of 16 or above. Mm-hmm. So we have an obligation about age assurance. You must have age assurance to prevent children seeing pornography. But we also say, if your terms and conditions don't permit pornography, you don't have to comply with this. So I think those things. I think you're quite right that when we were thinking about the proportionality of the code, we kind of baked it into the code itself to make that appropriate. So yes, and I think also when you look at the DSA, of course you have, Booking is a VLOP, very large online platform, but then the risk assessment and the risk mitigation is very much for you to assess the risks and propose ways of mitigating it that meet it. So I do think that guidelines can be very important. The DSA came in very quickly. Sometimes it's not possible to do guidelines without some experience as well. Yeah. So if I look at one thing like, say, recommender systems and the harm caused by recommender systems, again, the booking recommender system may cause different types of harm or have different risks, more to do with consumer protection risks, whereas in social media it could do with minor protection risks or electoral integrity and civic discourse risks. So that is something which I think is absolutely ripe for there to be guidelines on, both in the minor protection guidelines and in the risk mitigation guidelines. But it's probably not realistic to. It's not a one-off. I think compliance. The nature of the risks change. The research changes. What people know. So it's an ongoing dialogue to make people safer. But clearly, people are not safe yet. Sorry.
No, that's great. If we move on to a bit more looking forward, looking ahead with the next mandate, looking at you, Anna, the Greens have been calling for new rules, more specifically for addictive designs online and also for e-commerce. So I'm thinking you don't think that's enough regulated for the risks they pose, and apparently it seems like the newly reconfirmed Commission President von der Leyen has heard you and seems to be thinking along the same lines, since she mentioned in her mission letters the Digital Fairness Act and also mentioned the needs for more action on e-commerce. So what sort of rules do you think are needed, given that we already have some other tools in place, from the DSA to other directives like the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive? What is needed, and what is possible to do in this new Parliament and in your new, well, not your new, but your committee which makeup has changed with this new election?
Yeah. Allow me one remark to the previous discussion, just a little anecdote also from why sometimes regulation is a little bit more complex, because there is also so many different groups, different companies, different stakeholders, different whatever, and then they all want a special treatment or they want a special whatever in the law, and that's why also sometimes the law gets more complicated, because this and this platform says, okay, for me it's different, then the other company says, okay, but for the whatever companies it's different. So that's why also sometimes laws get more complicated, also because of lobbying. Which is, I'm not against lobbying, you know that. It's just, of course, we exchange with the stakeholders, and stakeholders have different needs, and that makes laws more complicated. But then back to the question, and also coming back to this peak. question, for me, is also a little bit the wrong question, because of course it's not schematic. It's not like, okay, now we did 3 big digital laws, we did more, whatever, and okay, this is 1, 2, 3 fulfilled, and that's why the peak is reached. I think we need to look at the needs, and we need to check if there's gaps. We need to check if there is probably also new challenges, developments coming up, because especially, you know, in the tech sector, we have so fast developments that sometimes we cannot even cope. And I think the e-commerce is the perfect example. I think when we did the product safety legislation last term, Shein and Temu did not even exist, I think. And the number of individual e-commerce has, I don't know how much, doubled, tripled, whatever since then. And that's why I think a lot of more lawmakers, it's not just the Greens, I mean, it's really in my committee, I think across the board, across all political groups, mentioned it as a priority that, citizens talk to them and say, okay, we fear that our products are not safe anymore. Consumer protections organizations are coming and saying we have a problem. And also a lot of European companies are coming. The other day I had the toy industry in my office saying, okay, they comply with the European standards, but all the cheap imports from China don't. So it can also, you know, happen that new challenges come up, and then we have to actually also see how we adapt the legislation. Do we have to create new one? Do we wait and implement what is already there? But I see probably 2, 3 areas where indeed I think we need to update our legislation or come up with further legislation. One is indeed the digital fairness, and you mentioned it also, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen put it even forward herself. The Commission, as you know, will come up with a big study quite soon. I think it's supposed to come out every day with a mapping where we have gaps. And also my committee in the last term put forward a known initiative report on addictive designs. And I think it's very much also related to the question of minors, but also to the mental health of all of us. Do we spend endless hours on social media? Are we dragged into buying stuff that we don't want? And I think it's a very important question for sustainability, but also for consumer protection, for minor protection. And I think a lot of groups in my committee want a Digital Fairness Act. As I said, a lot of groups in my committee, and not just the Greens, just to mention it again, want to see more action on e-commerce. And of course, it's about DSA implementation. It's about the big customs reform that is going on, where the parliament did already its homework. We voted on the customs reform already. Now we're waiting for the member states that they come up with a general approach so that we can enhance our customs control. But I think there is still some gaps on the design of the e-commerce platforms, and also probably on responsibility. A lot of market surveillance companies tell me they cannot even grasp some of the platforms if there is unsafe products. And then a third topic that I see, and we discussed already about it, I think we still need to see where we have to better combine sustainability with digital policies. And I think there, we started in the AI Act also with including some environmental standards, but I think we can still have a better convergence between the digital agenda and the environmental agenda and the Green Deal.
Lucila, in her mission letter to Commissioner Designate for Tech Sovereignty, Henna Verkunen, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen didn't mention so much the enforcement of the AI Act, and instead she focused on a lot of initiatives to boost AI innovation through high-performance computing. How did you read this mission letter in terms of what you're expected to do at DG Connect in the next mandate?
Well, first of all, as you know, we set up an AI office, following the AI Act. Then at the end of January, a Commission decision set up the AI office, and the Commission decision already decided that the AI office was going to be responsible both for the implementation of the regulation as well as for the research and innovation policy in the area of AI. And the two go hand in hand, because at the end, the regulation is about creating more trust in the use of the technology. So our policy objective is to have artificial intelligence developed and used in the European Union. And to have that, you need to have trust. And once you have trust, then you'll have higher use and you'll also have innovation. So the two go hand in hand. And we always say that colleagues have to work closely together on these different issues. So on the basis of the mission letter, of course, we have to implement the AI Act, and we are doing a number of things. I already reminded the AI Pact, the Code of Practice for General Purpose Models will come with some guidance on the prohibitions, which will be applicable already in February, and I hope it will be sufficiently early and not too late and in time for the prohibitions to be applicable. But we are also working already on the innovation side, because in the first 100 days of the new Commission, we'll have already to announce the first AI factories, which are basically a strengthening, if you want, of the supercomputers activities. We have in Europe one of the leading global networks of public supercomputers. They're co-funded by the European Union and by the European Commission and the member states. And we want the supercomputers to become better at training AI, and also at offering other services in terms of software engineering and also in terms of training. So we want to create these AI factories, and we have to start announcing the first factories, as I said, in the first 100 days. And then we'll put in place a strategy, which is already called Apply AI Strategy. And this strategy will be based very likely on a consultation of stakeholders, and we'll be looking at how we can bring AI to the different sectors of our economy. Because if there is one advantage economically we have in the European Union, is that we have some very strong industrial sectors we don't want to lose. And learning to use generative AI in particular and fine-tuning generative AI for the industrial sectors, energy, manufacturing, even service sectors, I think it's going to be extremely important for our economy, and I think that's also what the Draghi report recommends. So we have at our disposal some funding programs, Horizon Digital Europe program, and we hope to continue having this also funding support to be able to stimulate pan-European engagement in our innovation activities, because they are essential.
Werner, the Commission produces a lot of strategies over the year, over different mandates. What comes next in terms of like pushing for investment or actually making it possible for European startups and scale-ups to get the funding they need to go beyond that?
Well, strategy is not a dirty word in itself. It's a bit like compliance. And I think especially coming back to Europe Fit for the Digital Age, which resulted in the big strategies, overall digital, making Europe Fit for the Digital Age, creating European data spaces or a single market for data, having the AI strategy that we've implemented in the last few years. These were all strategies that were absolutely fundamental in giving direction to us all, including the member states, right? Once again, coming back to the Digital Decade policy program, that was unthinkable just 5 years ago, and now everybody's aligned that collectively we need to invest into all of that. And not just invest each other, but also jointly, because it was one of the parts of the strategy that some of the digital infrastructures and technologies are too big to be achieved by one individual member state. And Lucy just gave the example of the high-performance computers. This, over a couple of years, Europe became a global leader in terms of supercomputing and the networks that we have. And now we translate this through the AI factories and other initiatives to make that accessible to our startups and researchers and so on. Microprocessors also became very important during the crisis when even the car industry was running out of chips, right? Because they were needed elsewhere in countries that supplied us with those. Again, not a single European country can ever produce the microprocessors that we need. We can't even produce enough jointly. But by working together, at least, we can be much more effective than we were without working together. If we want autonomous vehicles driving through Europe, we need uninterrupted 5G coverage. So you need 5G corridors everywhere. So it's the investment part, it is the collaboration part, working together part. It is the single market, which is, of course, mentioned in all of those reports from Draghi letter and what have you. And that's absolutely fundamental. And Lucy already said, if we hadn't prepared an AI Act at the European level, we would have had 27 AI laws. When we thought about the DSA, and I was still involved in that at the time, one of the drivers was that there was increasing national fragmentation coming up and how we deal with Facebook and hate speech and this, that, and the other. Now we have a single rule book. So that's a single market. Then we need the skills. That's probably the thing that holds us back more than anything else, and the shortage of both advanced and basic digital skills. That is what companies would really need to innovate and to become more competitive. So that needs to stay a big priority. Another big priority is capital markets. And this is really where member states have to think about it again, that we need a fully functioning European capital market. Someone mentioned before, was it Peter or someone else, why the US has been more successful than we were. I agree with Anna, it was not legislation that held us back. But inter alia, it was the lack of risk capital, of venture capital. Our very good startups, scale-ups, also in the digital area that we have, including on AI, if they want to get to the next level, and then they need not 500 millions, but they need 1 or 2 billions, where do they have to go? They still have to go to the US because we don't have a capitals market. So there's lots of dots to be connected here.
Talking about the US, the EU is really close to the US, and there's an upcoming election in Washington or in the US coming shortly. How do you think cooperation or collaboration exchanges with the White House might look like, depending on whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is elected?
You're asking me this question 1 minute and 11 seconds before the end of the session.
You've got 30 seconds for this one.
Which is great, because I can just say some blah, blah, and then I leave the room quickly. No, I think, first of all, the collaboration with the US was extremely good, important, and successful in the last 5 years. So from the beginning with the TTC, the Tech and Trade Council, and really coming from the top political level, driven by the top political level, has been instrumental. We have much, much better and closer relations and dialogue and mutual understanding than in the past. And at all levels of the administration and also higher up, I think nobody challenges the need to work closely together in the future. You mentioned, or Peter mentioned, the geopolitical environment in which we are in today. It's a no-brainer that the like-minded nations of this world need to work together and will work together, and we are in this together. So I frankly don't think that the outcome of the elections will be a thumbs up or thumbs down, because both sides know that we are in this together.
Thank you, Werner. That was our last question, because we're reaching the end of our allocated time for the panel. So thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees. We ask the attendees to remain seated, as the next session will take place after a quick state change. In a few minutes, Aoife White, my editor, technology and competition editor, will interview Microsoft's corporate vice president and head of competition and regulation for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, Nicholas Banasiewicz. Thank you all for being here with us today, and have a good day.